One of the problems that we were not trying to fix was something like we're trying to fix with antimicrobials or medical countermeasures, and this will become relevant as I speak later. What to me is common about those problems is that one, you don't want to use a medical countermeasure. You'd like to have it stockpiled, but you don't want to use it. And the second is, if you have a new antimicrobial, an infectious disease doctor will say to you, we're delighted to have it, but we don't want to use it. So these present particular problems that we were not trying to solve. The problem that we were trying to solve was tropical and neglected diseases. You will note that I had a little red set of text come up. And the point of that is to say that in the original article, we did include an access requirement, and this will become relevant as I go further. Let me just ask before, it'll help me make my decision about how much detail I go into. How many of you know what the priority review is and how it works? Raise your hand. Okay, so the priority review voucher, which was passed in 2007, does this, and what we proposed in the article is the following. It says that if you come up with a new treatment, a new therapeutic, for a list of tropical and neglected diseases, and I will show you that list in a moment, that you will then win a voucher, which you will then exercise on a second drug that you are intending to bring to the U.S. market. And you will get priority review, which is a shorter review. We intentionally did not pick accelerated approval or fast track because both of those of you who know, obviate some of the safety studies. It's a different approach. But priority review, there's no change in that. We didn't want to take on that objection that there might be a safety issue. It was always our intention that there would also be a market for priority review vouchers, that once one won one, that you might have in your own company, and we certainly have seen companies up here today that are large enough and have a broad enough portfolio that they might want to exercise it. But the notion was that I might win a voucher and I might then want to sell it. And if I wanted to sell it, that would be because I was a small manufacturer or a small company. I could also then make myself more desirable as an acquisition target. And we had interesting conversations, and I won't tell you all the anecdotes, but certainly talking with people in the Congress, some of them said, well, gee, why would you want to sell it? And my response back was, Senator, let me ask you this. If you were going to buy a car and you were told you could only sell it once, would that make it more or less valuable? And they thought for a moment and said, well, that would make it less valuable. And of course it would. So the idea here is that we feel like that priority review vouchers, there are going to be different needs. We never even talked about in the first paper whether another company is in a race with another. I can show you an example, although I've taken that slide out. That the value is that you would then be able to say, I want to be rewarded, it's an incentive for coming up with a new treatment for a tropical neglected disease, but then I'm going to use it, and the value I'm going to create is by having faster review through the FDA and get to market quicker. So there are two benefits. One is to speed approval for these U.S. therapies, and also to create an incentive for neglected tropical diseases. This is the list. Interestingly enough, you'll notice there that Chagas has the date 2015, and I wish Peter Hotez was still here. We relied on the Sabin Vaccine Institute, or the Sabin Institute, to come up with the list. And when it was first created, there was an oversight, and Chagas was the oversight. You will notice that you will recognize all of these. Ebola was included and added in 2014, Zika in 2016. What's interesting is they've now added medical countermeasures as a material threat in rare pediatric diseases in 2012. And I want to come back to that. That was not our original intent for it. To be perfectly candid, I have mixed feelings about the two of those being added, and I'll say more about why my feelings are mixed. If you look at the vouchers that have been awarded, there are 13 of them. The NTD side, you can see these four. These are apparent to this audience. If you look on the non-NTD side, and I don't know why that paren is not filled in there, But the point of it being that by in the current legislation, which was the 21st Century Cures Act, the non-NTDs will have their approvals will sunset in 2020 and in 2022. I have mixed feelings about this because what that does is it creates uncertainty for manufacturers who are pursuing the voucher to know that at some point in the future it may cease. Now, I have mixed feelings about the whole category being created, but I think it exacerbates the problem by saying it may sunset out there. Those of you who are more familiar with Priority Review Voucher will know that when pediatric oncology was added, that it was done on a 3-year trial basis, and manufacturers face the same thing. Will it be around? Will it be real? As you know, the cycle times are very long for drug discovery, and so I think that in the sense of pilot testing, perhaps, but I think it introduces a kind of uncertainty that I think isn't helpful to the program necessarily. You will notice that there have been a lot of vouchers awarded since 2014, and in that sense it's a good thing because it languished for some time. My friends from Novartis will remember that Quartum won the first voucher back in 2008. The bad news and the news that's not here is that the first voucher was exercised on a drug called Ilaris. In those days, you had to give the FDA 365 days of advance notice that you intended to exercise the voucher, something that we had always objected to, had never proposed in our paper. But what happened for Novartis was they didn't have all their data, but they knew they wanted to try to make this claim, so by the time they got their data, it wouldn't support it. So the first voucher, the value of it was less than zero. So we were very crestfallen to hear that. The good news of having other categories for vouchers is that then invigorated the category. People started going from being questionable, is this real, is this something that we should think about, to saying, oh, I guess it really is real. There have been a couple of papers. There are 3 of us, as I was introduced. It's actually Henry Grabowski, David Ridley, and myself. I was the original PI, got the grant, and quite frankly, it was originally my idea walking off a plane, having read a paper about HIV/AIDS and all the indirect value that was created through these 3 approaches that I just gave you: accelerated approval, fast track, and priority review, came out of the response to the HIV/AIDS crisis. Activists were saying, hey, we know you have a process and you're trying to respect that, but we're dying. We would like to have, we're risk-seeking. We'd like to have an accelerated approval. So what I said to Henry as we walked off the plane is, I wonder if we could monetize this and create value. We also are aware that FDA folk, their primary charge is to protect United States citizens. Asking them to think about and consider the global burden of disease is a different category, and I would say it has evolved considerably. Now in 2014, there are lots of reasons for us to be more concerned, and certainly the agency is more concerned. But our challenge at the time was to create a rationale for an FDA located in the U.S., charged with the responsibility of protecting U.S. citizens, to care about the global burden of disease. So we're economists, so forgive us. I haven't shown you all these slides. I'm trying to move quickly, but when you add other diseases, rare pediatric disorders, medical countermeasures, what happens is the quantity or the number of vouchers increases, and that inevitably makes the price go down. So when you're trying to create an incentive, and I'll show you our estimates, when we wrote the paper in 2006, we used a basket of drugs that had received priority review as compared with standard review, and the average was about 10 months. And when we compared that with the values of those selected drugs in that basket, that created about $322 million of value, theoretically. That was based on our paper. In the scheme of things, those of you who are familiar with drug discovery, that's actually a pretty small sum. We never intended it would be an incentive. It would certainly never rival something like an advanced market commitment, and that it would be adjunctive to other commitments. But we wanted to raise the profile of tropical neglected diseases. We wanted to create some kind of incentive. So here what you see is that as the quantity of them increases, that can put a downward pressure on the price or the value of the voucher. So other things that can have changed since we wrote the paper and have created a downward pressure on prices is FDA in general is faster now with standard review, so the delta between standard review and priority review is less. And as I said earlier, there are more vouchers. If you look at these values, and these are vouchers that were won and then have been exchanged, and I'm sorry that that February 22 value didn't come through, it's $125 million, and that was the most recent exchange. Sarepta sold theirs to Gilead. I think there are some idiosyncratic factors for Sarepta of why they may have been moving to that lower value, but we had always predicted, and this comes after the 21st Century Cures, that if there are more eligible categories, then the likelihood of there being more vouchers in the future is true. Therefore, one could argue that there would be less value, and that's where they're less scarce. We reached a peak back in August 15th of a $350 million purchase of a voucher, which means that's the value at that time in the exchange between selling that voucher to another company. So in the current environment, there have been two calls for change. The first is, and this is a text from a letter, it's a number of NGOs have been involved, but this is the text from up on the Médecins Sans Frontières site. And we have, very good-natured and good conversation with MSF all the time. And they've, argued that novelty should always have been the feature and that somehow people are gaming the system. And I say it over and over, and I'll say it again to this audience this afternoon. We never intended for novelty to be the only factor. Here's the reason. If I have a new incentive and I say to people who are in small companies, large companies, wouldn't you like to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in research, development for this new, in the hopes that you would win this new award, but it's a completely untested reward. You need a proof of concept. So it was always our intention. We called it salvage. We went through a series of meetings. The way you do it in the academic world is we went to the American Economics Association, the International Health Economics Association, and if you had been a part of those meetings, you would have heard us talking about, well, what's going to happen is the first awards are going to go to drugs that already exist. Quartum, bedaquiline, whatever it might be. So we've never felt this way. We know that they are quite exercised about it and say, this is a terrible travesty. We did not feel like it was a travesty. It was never our intent. Now, it's 2017. We're happy to change the novelty requirement, and we would certainly agree that that's something that could happen now that the proof of concept has been achieved. But that was never our intent, and I'm afraid that some people have harbored that misunderstanding. So when the question is raised, is PRV stimulating innovation, which of course was our original intent, here are a couple of quotes. We had a conference back in November, and Mark Sullivan was there from Medicine's Development for Global Health, and there's no question, as we heard person after person present, talking about how they've been trying to raise capital using the prospect of winning a priority review voucher as one of the ways that they've been able to convince, whether it's their management team in their company or a group of outside investors, that the prospect of winning a voucher and that it has value is one of the reasons that they should invest. Certainly we want them to care about the disease and the patients and the burden, but we also know that people are making investments and are looking for exit strategies to get some return on that, and this has been one of the things that's in the arsenal to help convince that. The second is the requirement of an access provision, and as I said to you earlier, we had access language in the original paper that we wrote. A lot of things happen when you're trying to take a bill through the Congress, which includes talking to a lot of congresspersons. And they're quite varied in terms of their knowledge and the desirability of wanting to talk to them after you've talked to them once. That's supposed to be funny. I never failed in wanting to see their staffers again. I found their staffers to be uniformly smart, energetic, and interesting people. But what didn't get picked up was an access requirement. The question that I think is now before us is, well, what does that mean? So if I were to apply to say I want a voucher, I pay the user fee, which is about $2.7 million now for that to be reviewed, for the NTD drug to be reviewed. Then the question is, if there's an access requirement, what might that look like? So let me suggest some things that it might look like. So first, I think we have to acknowledge that the drug sponsor has control over some things and has partial control over some others. I think we also have to acknowledge that the FDA is not going to be doing a monitoring program, say, in Bolivia, or a monitoring program in any of the non-U.S. countries that we've been talking about in this meeting today. So it has to be something that's efficient for them as well. So one of the things we're very focused on at Duke is that licensing agreements that, let me back up. Our research suggests that of the new novel agents for tropical neglected diseases, that 90% of them are coming out of university labs. And so offices of licensing and venture are the ones that are doing this. And when we talk to those people, including our own at Duke, they have very little experience with putting the language together that allows for global access, to have an agreement that's with for-profit partners, like companies that are in the pharma industry who have a lot of experience with development, but also with other companies, Dindy, for example, who's here. What would that agreement look like? And if you had a group of partners and you have an inventor who's at a university, those offices of licensing and venture are saying, we don't know how to write these agreements. So one of the things we're doing right now is creating a clearinghouse that says, here's all the language, the ones that we're aware of, and trying to get people to contribute to that, so that if I'm in an office of licensing and venture at any university, I can go and see this pool of language and that's appropriate for those. So what one criteria might be, does the licensing agreement promote global access in continuing development? An ongoing responsibility, and we've certainly heard about it with benznidazole here today, is that there's a continuing assessment of dosage and toxicity, especially if you have a side effect profile like this. You would like to see the sponsor continue that. The sponsor doesn't have undivided control over this, but I can certainly see them collaborating with others to say, what is the plan for procurement? That could be in all the countries where it's endemic, or it could be a country. What's the distribution to safe and accessible places for treatment? What does that look like? Is there a plan for that? Diagnosis and treatment integrating into the health system. Some of the very things we've been talking about here in the United States could be true for a country where you'd say, we have a plan for that, we'd like to talk about that. Increased health education for providers and patients, and then finally some kind of patient support. We would like to see more dialogue about this, just as there's been a call all day here that we should do more collaborating. We'd like to go from sort of the shouting match about that there ought to be an access requirement into PRV into actually be having substantive conversation about what would that look like, what of that is in the control of the drug sponsor, what of that is not, and what is something that the FDA could do and would be a reasonable request of the sponsor. We would be happy to see that added. So with that, I'll say thank you.